Hello, everyone. Thank you for being in our session. Today, we will talk about responsible AI and human experience, a multicultural take. So the idea behind this session is that we have spoken quite a bit about it, I think, yesterday as well, but when we talk about values, when we talk about ethics, when we talk about a lot of high-level things, we first, I think, forget a little bit about the operational human experience or psychology, but also we forget that it's not just about a person, but groups, and groups have their own cultures, subcultures, etc. So that's kind of the conversations I want to have with you three today. But before we start with any question, I want to ask you to introduce yourself the way you want people to know you for this conversation. What should be important for them to know about yourselves to enter the multicultural talks? We go like this. Johannes, you go.
Let's see if my microphone works. It kind of works, am I right?
It works.
Awesome. Perfect. Yeah. It didn't work before. Hi, I'm Johannes Karl. I'm at the University of Zurich, and I am, how would I best describe myself? I am a culturally evolutionary psychologist. So I'm really, really interested in where human variability comes from, and how human variability, both on a long-term level and on a cultural level, intersects with the world we're building today, because there's a lot of mismatches happening, and the world is evolving rapidly and changing rapidly, and trying to understand it from how we're set up and how we deal with the world is really, really interesting for me. So that's what I do.
Hello, everyone. I'm Osner. You can find my full name in the program. It's impossible to pronounce in English. So I'm a second-year PhD student at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. It's a small research university in Italy. I'm also visiting a PhD researcher at Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law. I have a background spanning law, economics, and sociology. And my work, my research sits on the intersection of AI data regulation and EU law. So today I will try to answer Oxen's questions from the perspective of my work in emotional surveillance, more specifically AI-enabled emotional surveillance. So I'm so happy to be here and a bit excited to be speaking at the same panel with these experienced researchers, but we'll see.
It was fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Good morning, everyone. My name is David Barnes. I'm a retired U.S. Army Brigadier General, philosophy professor. I currently visiting professor here at the Institute, at TUM, and senior fellow at the Kennedy School of Government. My interest in this space is coming from really an operational standpoint, which is I'm very excited to join you guys in this conversation, because as we know, the technology, built in isolation, what happens when it's brought out into the world? And we've heard so many panelists describe some of the issues with that. So I look forward to this conversation today as we sort of talk about it through the lens of culture.
Thank you very much. A very interesting panel. I'm seeing the questions I pre-prepped, and now I'm like, are they really that interesting, or should we go directly to the hard questions? But let's start slowly, and then I'm sure with the conversation starting a bit more between yourselves as well, we'll go into the hard things. So Johannes, your research shows how culture shapes human behaviors, right? And our interactions with AI, how they impact us, how they impact also society as a whole. What's a cultural assumption in AI design that often goes unchallenged?
Awesome. Okay, so I have to start here and kind of reveal something really, really embarrassing about my field of psychology. And one of the issues we have, and a lot of the work a lot of the thinking about AI and how people interact with it is built on, is highly Western. There's a really, really nice study out there by Joe Henrik and others where they show that around 96% of all studies published in psychology capture only 12% of the world population. If you are an American college student, you have a 4,000 times as good of a chance being in a study than if you are from anywhere else in the world. We know quite a lot about how American East Coast psychology college students and sometimes West Coast college students think about things, but for the majority of the world, we have actually a very thin empirical basis, which is a bit of an issue, which then comes often with an assumption around universality. One of the things that I heard here throughout yesterday and also today is people, for example, talking about values, value alignment, what values are. And psychologists have developed a framework for values that we think is universal and that also applies across cultures. But how people enact those values really, really differs globally. What does it mean to care for family? What does it mean to honor tradition? Really varies. And often in the AI space, people talk about values, and they talk about value alignment, but they're never clear aligned with whose values and specify what those values actually are concretely, which then gets you into devil's kitchen if you try to roll it out across a cultural space.
Thank you. Does anyone want to jump on that? I'm just waiting to see reactions, what's going to trigger each other.
Drink some water too. Real fast
so Özner, your turn. Your work on emotional surveillance highlights how AI can threaten autonomy in ways that vary across cultures, right? So how does a multicultural lens change our understanding of the risks of emotional surveillance?
I think a multicultural lens, first of all, would help us overcome a common misconception and recognize that emotions are not universal signals with uniform expressions. Actually, they are culturally shaped in the sense that our cultural background affects both how we experience and how we express emotions. So, for example, a study found that mental representations of pain and pleasure are physically and perceptually distinct in Western and Asian cultures. So now imagine more complex emotions such as guilt, resentment, jealousy. So due to their complexity, emotions are really difficult for AI systems to accurately infer and categorize. In terms of how it works, so emotional AI systems, I call them emotional AI systems, but they are like AI systems with emotional recognition capabilities, but I call them briefly that. So emotional AI systems infer and classify emotions based on what they learned from their training data. So for an expression to be recognized by an AI system, it must have been represented in the training data set. However, emotional AI systems generally don't account for racial, ethnic, or cultural differences. Actually, there was a study, and they found that facial expressions of racial minorities, particularly Black people, are more likely to be linked to negative emotions than those of white people, even when their expressions are identical. This shows that emotions are really difficult to actually for AI systems to predict. In terms of privacy and autonomy, these concepts are also culturally shaped, like emotions. So I think a multicultural lens would help us to interpret them in their cultural context, as different cultures attribute different values and meanings to those concepts. For example, in some cultures, people are encouraged to be more reserved and less expressive. I think these differences in understandings of cultural differences in understandings of these concepts can even be reflected in countries' privacy laws. For example, every country, for example, EU has a more strict data protection framework than many other countries. So I think a multicultural lens can help us to not only design and govern these systems towards more accuracy and inclusivity, but also help us to regulate them more effectively.
Thank you. And sorry, Dave, I'll get to your question after, but I have a follow-up about this, and maybe all of you can react to that. So if we talk about AI systems that tries to recognize emotions, because as you said, accuracies in the sockets, right? How, without thinking about ethics, just technically, operationally, how would we even be able, considering what emotions are, which, as you said, they have a cultural aspect. They also have a physiological response aspect. They also have sometimes, I don't know, like normative aspects, right? How could we even build an AI that actually recognizes emotions? According to any of you, if anyone has a good idea about that, is it even doable?
I think it's not, because like there are many studies showing that how biased like these systems and how they are not actually able to accurately like infer and recognize these. But still somehow they do that, and they, I think, like determine a norm, and then like go with it. Like they actually don't account for any like differences in cultures and whatsoever. I mean, they try to probably. I don't have a technical background. I don't know how it works, but like from the studies I read, I mean, it looks like impossible to me. I don't know.
So I mean, I think part of the struggle from a technological standpoint, and this was highlighted this morning by Carmen and Ing's presentation, right? Looking at different foundation frontier models and how they look at even just the ability and the frustration between translating languages themselves, as well then as emotion and moral action, ethics, et cetera, right? Because they're current language models they're stochastic. The data is the world that it is, assuming that we can actually have accurately captured it, not the way that we want the world to be. And so even with the inference layer added to that, right, there's this struggle between it. And it really came to light. I was working with a startup that's on hand signals for the blind, like, being able to do this. And it's, so there's a language barrier, right, because sign language is different in around the world. But then also, how do you get it to infer the same sort of nuances captured in spoken language, things like emotion, et cetera, now with nonverbal expressions, to not just interpret it, right, to record it, interpret it, translate it, but then actually through an avatar, right, be able to provide that back with the same sort of level to really be useful. And I think that's a really important project, but it's unclear, I think, that the current technology is, right? So then it becomes more the work of what's the next layer, the middle layer, right? As you are building off these fallible frontier models, and how then can you impart the values in the APIs and everything that you're using to do that? And maybe that's where the best promise is. But I thought that was fascinating to look at the sign language as a case study.
That's, by the way, like sign language is also really, really interesting, because there have been some older studies in like Guatemala where they look at what actually happens to people's emotional experience, like theory of mind and expression, once they learn a sign language, because Guatemala didn't have its own repertoire for a long time. And so there are cohorts that learn a specific sign language, and that is kind of interesting, because the way how we can express ourselves and the mode we express ourselves also obviously changes what we can express and how we are thinking about certain things. And the other thing, especially about emotions, that is really, really interesting from a technical standpoint is, the old ways to get emotions out from text was the good old like Pennebaker approach. You count up how many sats and happies you have, and off you go, and then you do some waiting. The problem is that's a very, very entity-driven Western approach, where we encapsulate emotions based on specific adjectives. That's how we do it. But if you look at the cultural space, and I always like this, Batya Mesquita, she is up in the Netherlands. She does a lot of work on emotion expression across different cultures. And if Dutch students perform well in a medical examination, they say, oh, I felt really happy and I was excited and it was so great and it was so amazing. If you ask new Turkish migrants about how they feel about passing the medical examination, well, they sometimes say they're happy, but that's not primarily what they're saying. They say, when I got my examination results and I went home, my mother immediately got the examination results and went around the whole neighborhood and showed it to everyone. And like now grandmothers are knocking down my door to introduce me to their daughters. And people find, and that's a very, very different. So that's expressed in a context, in a verbal thing. But the problem is, if I'm just chucking out a model, and depending on its sophistication, it cannot make that discrimination. Also, it doesn't know at what stage, because people obviously don't stay forever in this mode of emotional communication. If you spend long enough in a culture, you will at some point get acculturated into their way of expressing emotions. That's the same way as in different languages, you're expressing emotions differently. My German personality is way less fun than my English personality because it's acculturated, and that's already a stretch. My English one isn't very fun. But so, and that's the other thing, especially then when you look not only at how different cultures do it, but also how you are situated in your culture when you're expressing the emotions, and what mode of expression you're actually taking changes hugely what inferences you can make.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please.
I think general inaccuracy and like a high level of biased nature of these systems is one of the reasons why they are not widespreadly adopted. Because like there have been a lot of trials, like even in the EU, in border management. There was a project called border CTRL. So I mean, they did a lot of trials, but like at the end of the day, they are so inaccurate that you can't just adopt them like in a country that that has such a strict data protection laws.
But then, I think I'm just going to drop all the questions I planned. Sorry, but now we talked about the how, but the should now. Should we actually try to have an AI that can recognize emotion, and also understanding different maybe cultural views on that, because I think it might be a bit more diverse. So maybe we can talk about different hues, and that relates to your work on surveillance. But I'm sure everyone has. Dave, jump in.
I mean, you know, if the titans of AI, right, the 4 or 5 of them, claim that we're on a path to general intelligence. And I think in their minds, one of the goals is that these systems will not only be more intelligent, super intelligent compared to humans, but also be able to capture all the nuance and emotions and everything else, right? But back to your question of should it be? So one, I don't think we're on the current path to AGI. That's for technical reasons. And second, you know, even if you build a frontier model in China, like DeepSeek, or in Mistral, you know, in France and in the EU, and try to expand sort of the cultural data and infuse it as part of it. Much like in the military, your plan never survives first contact with the enemy. The AI systems don't survive first contact with humanity. I mean, the world is messy, it's dirty, it's fun, it's sad, it's an incredible joy and just horrible, you know, what we see, destruction and war. And in a sense, I think our focus shouldn't be on technologically solving this problem through the AI models themselves, but really turn the lens back on the human system, right? And so, you know, be able to address how we want to use this technology, because we're talking about fundamental questions, I think, that AI has actually allowed us to shine the light on problems, age-old problems that we've been wrestling with, right, in all our different fields that we haven't solved. And if this is an opportunity for us to come to some sort of, you know, reflective equilibrium perhaps about them, you know, with the technology, but not place that burden on the technology. I don't think that's the right way to have the solution.
If you know, do you want?
Go.
I mean, I think we should accept that not all types of human experience can be automated or assessed by AI systems. Like, I think emotional expression is one of them. Like, it's super context dependent. It depends on many factors, including culture, but culture is not the only like factor affecting like how we experience and express our emotions. So there are so many. So I think we should just acknowledge the limits of AI when it comes to certain things. So we don't like have to. I think we don't have to do that. Like,
yeah, fair. We don't have to. Go, Jan.
And I think I like the idea that like it's a really useful thinking exercise also to shine the light on what we currently don't understand. Like I also don't buy into like its magic hype. There's some really interesting conferences. For example, if you write 500 words about you, like I ask you write 500 words about who you are as a human being, and then I administer a self-report questionnaire, I can, like, the predictive validity of even a bog standard off-the-shelf like OpenAI model is around, for depending what personality aspect you're looking at, 60 to 65% of your self-report variability I can explain from whatever I can rip out with a large language model from 500 words, which is kind of interesting. But the question is, A, is that good enough? And B, the other really interesting part here is, once you move away from an English-speaking part, there's some really cool work by Muhammad Attari and colleagues, where they do it in a cross-cultural way, how much large language model, for example, moral judgments and human moral judgments agree when you leave the US. And what you can see is the further you move away from what we call the weirdness index, the Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic index, which is the US as the baseline here, you see roughly every step that you move out on that weirdness scale, you see the efficiency of the model at predicting moral choices drop by one standardized scale point, one whatever your scale is, which is quite a lot. And the other aspect that I find really interesting, there are so many questions we haven't solved yet that we can't really throw out. Like a lot of, like in the psyche spaces, oh, can we use AI to solve the clinician crisis? Because training clinicians is hard and there are not enough of them and there are never enough of them. Okay, cool, but like that presumes that we, for example, have an idea of what is normal. I used to work in New Zealand, and I used to work a lot with indigenous colleagues in New Zealand, and amongst Māori, it is relatively common that you hear the voices of your ancestors. And so sometimes clients come to clinicians and say, I can't hear the voices of my ancestors anymore. And the Western psychologist says, great, you're cured, you no longer hear voices, off you go. But that's obviously not what you want. That is not the appropriate normative expectation in that context. But even saying, oh, it's normal amongst Māori to hear voices isn't fully right. You need to ascribe to a specific belief about Vairua, the spiritual world, that it is normative for you. And that can sometimes get lost, and trying to understand that diversity is something we haven't managed from a human research perspective. So how comfortable are we to hand it off to an AI that we might or might not understand how it makes normative judgments about that?
I mean, that was one of the things that I was thinking, and really appreciate that example, right? It's really, I mean, that's one I'll stick with me for sure. If we just dropped AI from our conversation, and it's right now, this is a young conversation, right? We could really get into this. We'd still be having this conversation, right? I think.
Same conversation.
And I'm wondering, is the technology a distraction from this? Or is it, I mean, I think it's meant to help support and kind of help us work through some of these friction areas, I guess.
Could it support, though? No, but I want to go back to, you said chaos earlier, and that ticks another point I actually wanted to address today, chaos and human relationships, right? Because we've heard a lot lately about those relationship AI, companionship AI. I mean, of course, those are LLMs that are being used or prompted a certain way that end up into any kind of relationship aspect. We also see in research that there is a lot of research in East Asia on this. There's a bit of research starting in the West, in the word countries. Everyone's kind of panicking, if we're being very honest. Everyone's saying, oh, AI is going to take over even our human-to-human relationship. And I was listening to a talk of a very cool researcher. I can't remember her name right now, but I'll find it later. And she was saying, we need to remember that we love the chaos of human relationships. And I want to have your perspective on those relationship AI and maybe, well, I mean, Dave, more from an operational situation, right? Is that even doable? From your perspective, maybe on a more emotional situation, Johannes, from a multicultural perspective, is there anything that can we first even do it? So that relates a little bit to a first question about, can we even have AI that recognizes emotion? Therefore, can it even answer in a meaningful way to those needs? And then further, if you have any other thoughts about this topic, I'm sure the conversation will flow, so whoever wants to start.
I mean, AI companies are also emotional AI systems, because emotional AI systems don't infer emotions only based on facial expressions or physiological signs. They also do it using words. So they're also considered emotional AI systems. So, I mean, we all know that these systems are manipulative, but I think they are also discriminative, because, I mean, when we look at that, like when we look at the cases, like, I mean, suicides, like self-harm, all those people are, I mean, they are either young people or they are people suffering depression or loneliness. So I think these systems indirectly also discriminate towards those people, because, I mean, it's kind of like a targeted inclusion. They target those type of people, those who suffer from like grief, depression, loneliness, or like young people whose frontal lobes are not developed yet. So I think they're also discriminative, not manipulative. So I find them very harmful in every sense, and I recently started like looking at those as well, because they're also considered emotional AI systems. So I think they are very interesting, and there are many like research questions that can be derived from that like practice itself, but I find them very harmful.
Just to kind of follow up on that, there's obviously a range of different thoughts. One of the ones is we just recently did a study which was kind of interesting, where, and by the way, please, if you have free time, talk with me about values. I love talking about values, where we essentially like got models to pretend they're regular students with the instruction that they should model different values, and we got people's own values. We recorded them, and what we see is we see the classic effect. If a model portrays values that are important to you, you like it more. If it portrays values that are opposed to you, because we believe there are opposing pairs of values, you like it less. By the way, the only people that don't want to be friends with someone of their own value are people high on self-enhancement, so achievement, power, and dominance. They just don't want to have friends that are also high on achievement, power, and dominance, because no sharing here. But the interesting thing is what we're doing right now is, because you can essentially build a feedback loop. We asked people, how much would you like to interact with this agent again? And they were way more willing, and they produced more text, which means that the model now gets more text, which allows it to infer your values in a cleaner, more robust way, which allows it to model its expression, which kind of can lead into a trapping, which is interesting in itself. But if coming to chaos, one of the really, really interesting things actually about, and I don't know how much time you spend on like character AI hub or something, but in reality, if you're trying to make romantic or friendly relationship with other human beings, you have to deal with the human beings that the universe kind of shuffles to you. Like if they are not in the pool of existing participants of your romantic life because they're not in your same vicinity or age group, they're not available to you. And that's quite in contrary to how people are using romantic agents, because you have a character card, you have a role description card, which has prescribed what this character does, what the background is, and that's all information that you wouldn't have about a real person. So you can pick a person or a character that you want to interact with based on your own preferences, but you don't have to move as far out of your comfort zone. And the other thing is also, because you are in control, the other, like there's relatively little agency on the other side, but especially if you're a young person, that's not how romantic life is supposed to work. You're supposed to go out there and have a chat with like the other like 14-year-old girl your age and get terribly your heart broken and then be sad forever and write sad, cringy lyrics about it, because it's a part of self-formation to deal with the instability and unpredictability of others. But that is something that is less prominently encoded in AI agents. So for me, the critical question is, what happens if it becomes a practice that is more normal because it is easy and accessible and safe and secure? what will people that have not learned to deal with rejection and insecurity actually do when they then later go out? At some point, they have to engage in a real romantic relationship, or we all gonna perish. Evolutionally speaking, that's gonna be the end. So,
well, we're all going to live in the metaverse, right?
oh man, I can't wait to leave my physical body. I have quite a lot of back pain, so off I go.
I really appreciate your point about, thinking of these systems all as, being emotional system, like, and being emotive in some sort of sense. I mean, because it's interesting, because I guess I've looked at it as being much more clinical, right? That, the algorithm itself may, the math is essentially unbiased potentially, but the data itself is that. This conversation draws me back to work by Shannon Fowler, right, up in Edinburgh, right? I mean, with the analogy that the AI is really like a mirror. It's a mirror to ourselves, a mirror to our society. And so we could kind of gnash our teeth about, it's an indictment of current, the loneliness, the independence, and so that's why individuals are turning to these different models for engagement and fulfillment, right, in a way that we didn't imagine. I mean, there's even a push to offer clinical level professional service, right, replacing certified, the doctors, psychologists, right, doing these systems. But also, if we expand the focus from just the generative AI and the agentic, I know that's the flashy object right now, and think of the whole ecosystem of artificial intelligence, we still have to wrestle with the problem with the data. But I think we also have to remember that every individual along the life cycle who's making a decision, even the person who's adjusting code. So maybe today you're writing something for the middle layer, right, as part of engagement, where you want to incorporate some of these broader cultural values into it. Every decision that she makes, whether she realizes it or not, is a values-laden one, right? So even something like optimizing code and what she trims, she may not recognize that making that optimization is actually a reflection of her background, history, culture, family, and whatnot. And so, again, it continues to highlight the need for bringing in people globally as part of this production, or else I don't think we're going to get to that point. But the chaos piece, right, maybe it's a mirror that reflects the chaos. And maybe that's okay. But we ought to recognize that that's the case then. I don't think we acknowledge it enough.
I have so many follow-up questions, but we don't have that amount of time. So I'll just go to the social norms thing. Because also where I want to go with that, and I'm just going to nudge you there, is do you think that there are societies and cultures that would welcome this more integration of AI as a potential companion, relationship companion? Not saying that we're dismissing the human-to-human companionship, right? But maybe integrating it more, and I kind of assume the answer is yes, we would have societies with more welcomeness to this and some with less. And if yes, then what are the potential factors that would make this value-wise more acceptable? And is that something that we could, share with each other? Could that impact other societies as well?
Yeah, I mean, if I may quickly, because I really don't have a fixed opinion about this in this space, but just anecdotally, on the news the other day, there was this, I'm from the Boston area, a World War II veteran was celebrating his 100th birthday and had no known friends, relatives, family, anything. And it was an appeal through the news report for anyone to come to his birthday party. And I think one area that I'm really fascinated with, because unfortunately both of my parents passed when they were young, is in the elderly care, the companionship from that standpoint. Yes, there's the more romantic and some other things that gets, I think, a lot of the conversation, but I think that's a really interesting place, right, where you age out. You see all your friends are gone. Who do you have? And maybe that's a really neat opportunity, depending on your culture, to be able to leverage that.
And like the old age aspect is really, really interesting. I think that also comes to one of the core issues when people talk about culture. cultures are not fixed entities. Like Japan isn't, well, Japan is a high tightness, high collectivist society, and that if you go like get Hofstede's stuff, like it is a high power distance, whatever you want to classify it. But that is not magically inbuilt. When Italy formed, it didn't magically acquire certain values. They weren't like bestowed down with the finger of creation. The values that societies hold and that we by extension hold, because we learn from society, because that's how cultural evolution works, are a product of historical and current day pressures that societies are facing. But as the era of time moves on, societies are facing different pressures. The Germany that I grew up in is no longer the Germany that it is now. And if you grew up in the US in the 60s, it's very different. It's empirically very different. The US, for example, is no longer as individualistic as it was. It used to be one of the most individualistic countries in the world. Has substantially tumbled, especially also depending which state you are looking at. So societies change, but the problem is we as individuals often don't change as much with society. Cultural learning, it continues for some time, but it tends to have phases where it's quite prominent. So what happens is if you move into old age, you start to hold different values often and different beliefs than the society around you. That's, the cranky old man yelling at the cloud. But the problem is a lot of the models that we are building don't take this temporality information often into account. Especially a lot of the models that are sprouting up right now, they're built on internet data, they're built on training data, they're not built on data from the 1960s. So the issue that can happen is if we think about culture as static and then we also devise agents that are static, we kind of introduce cultural mismatches between the user and how they have been enculturated, how the culture is now, and what the model actually can provide. And I find it really interesting because we often think about culture as here and now, a horizontal variation, but that's not the only variability that exists. There's also vertical variability in culture.
So it's a dynamic evolution
that the AI
cannot really, it's dynamic system approach. And so for an AI system to be able to capture this and to actually, let's assume building companionship LLMs right now that adapt to cultural needs, if we're going down that path, we would need an ongoing, but also a back in time, so like time machine Google, right? Where you like bring all of the internet from the beginning and then all the history we had before and then all the books and then maybe, how do you see that? A lot of like surveys of different generations and experiences that might have led to specific, would even be doable.
Well, there's a whole field about it now. It's called historical psychology, which is kind of fun. But the other really interesting thing is also, think about, for example, you growing up and there is, think about like the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example. If you were around, it was one of the formative experiences of your youth. There was a certain cultural moment and cultural experience around it. That experience and evaluation of that historical moment has shifted now. So not only have you aged, but also the perspective of society. And the question is now, when you would devise a model, you want to talk about your experience. You want to remember the fall of the Berlin Wall. Okay, what information should the model draw on? The information how it is evaluated now, or how it was evaluated when it was a formative event? How would we know when the information was? And I find it really, really interesting because when you take this dynamic approach, the question gets really, really chaotic.
It is chaotic.
Yes.
It's humanly chaotic. It's beautiful. Did you have anything else?
I think whether a particular culture is more inclined to accept this kind of, technologies depends on how they approach certain concepts such as privacy, personal boundaries, social interaction, even manipulation. And it also depends on how prevalent social isolation and loneliness among that society. I think I read somewhere that in the UK, young boys, they use AI companions for as girlfriends. It's very prevalent among those. So I think like how a certain culture value or interpret these concepts also matters. Like it's I think the most important thing in that sense.
All right, I think two things. One, thinking from an operational perspective, not just in the defense side, but any organization, right? You're a private company and you're trying to attract new clients, you're trying to engage. I mean, the idea of being more culturally aware is critical, right? To be able to connect with your client or future sales or whatnot. If you're a multinational corporation, right? I mean, you're obviously engaging across these different areas. And so there does seem to be this idea that we can leverage the technology to assist in some of this space, right? To at least, maybe not develop the full empathy, the cultural understanding to have the empathy, but have a better understanding and some nuance. But obviously it comes with some concerns. Another thing, talking about the historical piece though, saw that even the Catholic Church has created, basically a twin of saints. So you can engage, with someone, very religious, held very highly in esteem in the church, and talk about their lives and what they went through and whatnot, which is really a fascinating sort of use case of it. But then you wonder, as you dig deeper, it's like, okay, well, they're using historical documents to develop the personality, the cultural identity of this individual. And we want that, but we also want to be able to relate to it today.
Exactly.
And then who's deciding that, St. David, right, is accurate enough for whatever the case is, right? I mean, but I think that's just a really fascinating way that this idea of drawing in the historical, psychology and culture into the space.
By the way, one thing that I want to point out, often when we talk about companions, it's actually really, really interesting. We think about, I always think about the old Futurama episode where like someone marries the Lucy Liu bot, which for me is the first introduction to that, but whatever. But we often think about the relationships of individuals with companions, but that is not the only use that people actually have. One prime feature that we often overlook when we think about companions in romantic relationships are the bystanders to romantic relationships. So people that provide advice and insight on your human-to-human romantic relationship. And you kind of see the cultural issues sometimes crop up if you're an avid Reddit user and people ask something in like Reddit relationship and they get advice and then someone, the first answer is like, yeah, but have you considered that I'm not American? Like I can't just divorce my husband because that's not how it works here. That's not a thing. Like I can't hit the gym, get a lawyer and delete Facebook. That's not a thing. But one of the issues is obviously often, depending which model you're picking, they tend to perform quite sycophantic, which already your real life friends would normally do because they're most likely more friends with you than your partner. But there is more variability in the advice that you might getting that you are actually performing an idiotic relationship action that you might not get in the same way because you are asking a question to the model which acts on good faith because that's the only information that it has, versus your friend holds contextual information about your whole relationship that might not even be visible to you. They might have observations about your relationship that you are not consciously aware. So they're providing more complex, situated, culturally appropriate insights than a model can, except if you're willing that the model will observe you all day, every day, then it might have more nuanced observations.
Yeah, which we might have one day. Yeah. But one thing I know it's difficult, at least for some of my friends, is if you prompt them in sort of this way, right? Okay, here's the situation. What's the next step? Meeting this other person. You want to ask them out or whatnot. Give me 3 courses of action and the pluses and negatives with it, and assess them and then make a recommendation. Well, your friend would probably look at you like, you're just crazy. Like, Dave, this is what you should do, right? The kind of thing, right? Because it knows all the background and whatnot. But the model actually maybe has an advantage of it. It says, oh, have you considered some of these other things? But then it sort of presumes that we're going to ask those kinds of like probing questions of the model and not just be like, all right, what do I do next? Yeah.
And yeah, go on.
I think the fact that they are also very good at personalization and mirroring is also an effect. I mean, they can like adapt their answers to your questions according to your preferences, how you talk to them, your behavioral data. So I think that's why they like we like them this much. For example, even the chatbot I'm using, the way that like it personalizes its answers and it mirrors my my way of talking. I mean, I like it. I mean, it's kind of you like that when a service is personalized, like to you, like specifically.
But now that brings, I think, another question to all of this, and it goes back to maybe the very beginning of this conversation. That's great that those LLMs can, for instance, answer those questions, or is it great? I don't know, but it can answer the, what should I do now? But what should I do now according to how it's been built? By the cultural point of view, it has been built in, and you were talking about the amount of representativeness we have in this, right? Which is none, or very low. So how could we, that's no question, reduce maybe, or enhance the cultural representation, enhance the diversity, and of course data, for sure. But do you have anything else? I know yesterday at some point in the panel we discussed about you cannot have an AI that works for everyone, right? So is that something, how would you see a potential solution to this, if there is any? And the answer can be there is no solution, because I feel like cultural diversity should be at the heart of all those conversations, yeah.
If I may, there's probably a partial solution there. In the olden days, you roll back all the way to like 1942 and then like back to the 60s, like the phonemic-phonetic discussion, and then later this whole idea of ethics and emics, which is really, so ethic is essentially there's one universal and I can go out and I take my belief and assume primarily that it is universal, and I go to a different culture and I try to see how I can instantiate this belief in a different culture. Depression, for example, is a great example. We assume that depression is everywhere, which, by the way, there's some really interesting research on North Korean defectors who have real issues in rehabilitation because there is not a good concept of depression around, because how would you say it? You're living in a utopia, you're not sad, you're a trader, which is interesting. So that's the ethic approach, which I often see people in the AI space taking. They implicitly assume that there is a true universal and that we can go out and we just need to find a way to operationalize the universal kind of correctly. There's a different approach, which is an emic approach. Every one of us has a cultural lens, and if we design a system from the bottom up, we often come to a different framework, a different solution, a different understanding. The question is then, how can I link this across cultures? And you might find that there are comparable elements where societies overlap in their understanding and elements that are not. One of the prime examples is, for example, personality. Psychologists believe there are 5 or 6 or 7 factors. It doesn't matter. I don't want to get into how many factors of personality are. I'm going to get sad. But let's assume there are 5. But the really, really interesting thing is, if you do it not from an ethic perspective, you can find the 5 nearly everywhere, but from an emic perspective, you get an answer that resembles the 5 different elements of personality that we'll find. But you get more nuance that is little enough error variance that when we look from a top-down perspective, we can kind of squish in a model, it just becomes unpredictable stochastic error. But when you go from a bottom-up perspective, you actually see that it is not random stochastic error, it is actually meaningful variation. So for example, in South Africa, people split, we in the West have a factor called agreeableness, which is how kind and friendly you are. In South Africa, that falls apart into relational agreeableness, and then essentially agreeableness in general. So you have essentially in-group relational agreeableness, and then you have agreeableness to the outside world. And those are very, very different constructs. You can squish them together if you want, but the question is, do you want it? And more conscious choices by developers on how okay am I actually with squishing some of those finer nuances together, or where do I actually need the full range of complexity, changes how we should develop models. Should we develop them bottom up or top down?
I don't know if technically there's any other way to ensure like diversity of these systems apart from like feeding them like diverse and culturally representative data sets. But from a legal perspective, I think we should integrate this cultural representativeness into the regulation of these systems. I think under the AI Act, there's already a requirement regarding the representativeness of data sets, but it's not like in the context of cultural representativeness particularly. And I think it's more of a abstract provision, because I think, as far as I know, there is no benchmark to like assess this representativeness in the Act, mentioned in the Act. It's more like ensure representativeness of data sets as far as possible. I mean, I'm not exactly working on cultural representativeness topic, but like, as far as I know, like the AI Act has that kind of abstract provision on that.
I don't know, do you want to comment on that now?
I just wanted to say, you're right, everything has been pushed a little bit. So.
No, I come back to the comment I made earlier, right, that the data, assuming that it's the right set of data, reflects the way the world is, not the way we want it to be. Only to say that we know that the current data sets are not representative culturally. Mm-hmm. But if we could wave our magic wand, and let's say that we actually could capture that, mm-hmm. Is that going to be enough? That we capture the current nuances and right, individual personalities, their cultures, their history, their societal, their language, all of, you know, not just what's come out of the West, the weird states, right, and what's currently on the internet. Is that really enough? Would we be satisfied with that? Mm-hmm. I mean, in a sense, we're still, I think, coming back to how then do we adjudicate conceptions of fairness, or, you know, if we want to go down the values track, or maybe where resources are allocated, or any of these really thorny kind of questions. So then you might ask if we want to move in that positive direction and shift the world, you know, maybe address the UN's, I can think of sustainment goals, right? Then what sort of data set would we need to train a model to guide us in that direction, right? I mean, and so I don't know. I'm right. It's kind of like, would we, if we could make it, we'd certainly be happy. But is that really where we want to go? It seems to me perhaps we want to go in an even further direction.
I think even in that case, we would find a way to discriminate against certain people, because like right now when like an AI system generates a discriminative output, we blame the system. But right, even if the system generates a correct output, I think people then would perform their autonomy on that system, and like find a way to discriminate against like certain people still. I think it's also a matter of mindset. Like it's not like it's not only the system. How we govern them, how we deploy them, how we regulate them, also a problem.
Sorry. If we can, because I'm looking at the time and I want to be sure we have at least 10 minutes of Q&A in case there are questions. So I'm going to give my mic to Darren. Now, the question for the Q&A is rather, what are the questions I didn't ask that you would want to ask those guys?
Hi, thank you for all the perspectives. I have two main questions. The first one is, thank you, David, for mentioning the differences in testing different models. And then you mentioned a lot of the cultural angle, the weirdness, then we want to unweird model thinking. I'm thinking about how likely that we can really have different countries ideally building their culturally representative model, which I think is not very likely. Let's say I learned from a researcher from the University of Tokyo that in Japan, some teams have built their native LLM. But if we walk into a Japanese bookstore, all the books are about GPT, ChatGPT. So there's already a difference in time and advantage and scale when it comes to what users are actually using. And let alone whether it's really realistic or probable that all the different countries and cultures can mobilize all these resources to build LLM. So that's the one question. What's your vibe on, like, do you see in the future the most likely scenario would be, oh, we will still be led by a couple of US-led weird LLMs, and the next thing we can do, or the best we can do, is to keep talking about how we use different tactics to unweird it. So that's the first question. And then the second question is the notion of companion. You mentioned like there's good parts like for old age people, but then there's also a lot of risk. So what would be the minimum guardrails that we could put in place? Would it be, oh, the tech platform should do more red teaming and then put a disclaimer on the front end, oh, just like smoking can cause lung cancer, be aware of loneliness risk? Like, is it their, do they have the incentive to do that since we can't outright ban like emotional chat with LLMs?
Cool. Okay, there comes a really, really interesting thing, especially when we think about the specific strategy of building representative chatbots, because, and there comes also a discipline issue, political science or political thinkers, and legal thinkers often think about countries as the entities of operation. But from a cultural perspective, that's often not true. Most countries are mixes of many, many different perspectives. Again, I take New Zealand as an example. You have Pākehā, so the colonizers, and Māori, the indigenous people. And they have very, very different perspectives. And who is making up the country is also shifting. And I'm fully conscious of the point that there will be resource constraints and everything to build things up amicably. But their cultural psychologists have done a lot of work trying to at least kind of try and group societies and cultures into larger order clusters that share some elements of similarity. We can talk about phylogenetic trees, how societies actually originate, but whatever. But even if we can pool some resources in those areas, we get better than nothing, because right now the mismatch is essentially driven how far are you away from the US or how far are you away from China if you're using a Chinese model. Decentralizing it at least somewhat globally would already, I think, be a relatively feasible strategy. One other point that I want to raise here is actually also really, really interesting, is when you have a model and an answer should be provided, and a culture-specific answer can be provided, and a more general, universally aimed answer can be provided. There is a binary choice that needs to be made, and not always is the culture-specific one the correct one, because you might not have information to provide. If any of you has been a sojourner across different countries and you slowly learned a cultural repertoire, you could try and use what you think is the correct cultural behavior right now, but you sometimes don't, because you're actually not you know that you are not certain that you will instantiate it correct or that you have all of the information. So you fall back on a more universal behavior to not make a fool out of yourself, because it's way more embarrassing sometimes to try something. Anyone that has ever tried an order in a French restaurant with like not possible French knows how embarrassing that can be. That's why, like Chinese restaurants have numbers next to the names. So that's number one. I probably pass off the companion question to someone else.
I can answer the second one about the minimum safeguards against AI companions. I think first of all we should recognize AI companions as emotion recognition systems, because, for example, under the EU law, emotion recognition systems are limited to those that functions that function based on biometric data. So like emotion recognition systems that which use words such as text sentiment analysis, they are not classified as emotion recognition systems under EU law. So I think this is a simple but like important first step as a minimum safeguard. Yeah, that's my point.
Yeah, no, and again, I think that's just a fascinating take of looking at these generative AI frontier models, and I really appreciate that. I just hadn't thought about that before. I think we've uncovered not just one, but a whole set of issues, right, and friction points. And there are potentially some ways that we can account for that, right? So we can use legal means, right, to either put a warning label on, on sort of what the end result is, right, or engaging with the model, at your own risk or something like that. We can look at the models themselves, but I think we have to look at two parts. One, the reality is, unless the global south can garner the resources, or we come up with new techniques of both expanding data sets, but also if using transformers and RAG and the current way that we're thinking through of generative AI, then they're going to belong in the weird part of the world. And so then the question is, then what? Yeah. And so we may be able to come up with some specific recommendations, but I think the more interesting question is, who is going to do it? Who is going to be the one responsible, right? Is this something that should be directed by the international community? I would ask what that is. Is it, right, I mean, we have some bodies that incorporate that. Maybe it's regional. But even then, we sort of have this overlay, I agree, of the international state system, right, post-Westphalian, that may not reflect reality. And so is it left to independent courts? Is maybe the EU Act is the way to go? We're wrestling this in the US between what should be at the federal level and what should be at the state level even. So I don't have a real good answer insight to those important questions, but I think, yeah, a lot of it is who do we pin the rose on?
Super good questions. Thank you. You make them go again for 5 minutes. Who else has a question? Tong has a question over there. Thank you, Darren.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talking. Actually, I'm not from the psychological domain, so maybe my question is a little bit superficial. I actually am thinking about before asking how should we build the emotional AI system. I want to ask. I always ask myself, do we really have emotions? Yeah, because I feel like emotion is just a reaction of the views of values that in our mind, and in Chinese it says like if you change your mind and then the emotion, if you observe your emotion, or if you change the thinking, your thinking way, and then the question has disappeared. So in meditation, it's also trained like that. I'm not sure. Yeah, and then so based on that, I'm thinking if. If you, just like the female researcher side, you send some prompts to the chatbot and then it gives you an answer, you feel like it can understand you much better maybe than your friend, because it can, through the logical inference thinking process, it can identify your consciousness, and then you feel like it understands you very well. So my question is, if we want to build a humanoid robot as a companion, and then do we really need to overcome the step of emotions, or if we just need to have more cameras and all the visual interaction technology to better to identify your emotions via your the movements of your eyes. And then I think it's just like the development of autonomous driving vehicles, and because it's also experience the process of human, like the imitation of human can driver, and then pass this step and then into the next step of build models and cameras and so on and so forth. So that's my question.
Sorry, can you summarize the question?
Yeah, so basically, yeah, in short, my question is like, do you think if we want to build a humanoid robot, we need to really understand what really need to overcome the step of emotions? Yeah.
Just do the thing.
Do the thing, okay.
You have 3 minutes.
Oh, shit. Okay. It doesn't help me to get more cameras to detect emotions because you cannot detect emotions on the face. Eichmann's work isn't real, it doesn't work. It will never work. There are no universal facial expressions of emotions that work anywhere. The reason for that is because emotions aren't real. The Stoic philosophers have realized that, the Epicureans had realized that they are constructions we make that's based on Lisa Barton Feldman's work and back in the old day on Jeffrey Allen Gray's work on predictive coding. You have physiological sensations that are an output and an input into the system. Like, think about excitement, for example. Like, you are going to give your wedding vows. It is really, really exciting. You are nervous, you're shaky, you're sweaty. Not me again. But that's exactly the same physiological responses that you are having when you're going up to an exam. But you were enculturated into, and can see that as children grow, how to interpret those signals in relation to the context to form what you have as an emotion. That emotion actually is an input in your further predictive coding, what you will actually do, because you know, you think that you are having either anxiety or excitement, and based on that you are changing your behavior. But obviously there is a bunch of people, if you're suffering from alexithymia, for example, you do not have the ability to either identify those emotions correctly, either physiologically, or you're not able to put the correct label to that. So the point here is emotions are really, really hard from a computational perspective, and interesting enough, the way that large language models kind of try to do prediction is actually kind of similar to how we are doing prediction when it comes to emotions. But we need to understand the context and the way that an individual is thinking about the context to make a reasonable prediction and we need to understand how context and sensation link together to make a prediction about the emotion. I cannot read it from the outside. If this would be the case, then couples therapists would be out of business, because then we could read it from the outside. It's really, the answer is really, really hard.
I'll give an extra 2 minutes for the other answers, 3 minutes for the other answers.
So, as I said in the beginning, I think we should know the limits of AI systems. So maybe we should take emotions out of the equation, and we shouldn't try to infer them or mimic them. Even from a moral point of view, I mean, when an AI chatbot replies to you in an emotional way, they mimic the emotion. So it's like lying. I mean, it's a synthetic response. So even from a moral point of view, I think it's not right. So maybe we should stop doing it altogether.
I mean, this is great. I found myself very much in agreement, right? I think let's abandon just. In fact, let's not even stop talking about emotions, because as a philosopher, I agree, it's an artificial construct. But what I really find fascinating in the physical AI space, when we move to maybe this care relationship bot to more in the physical, even if you can interpret the microfacial expressions, even if we could have access, that the bot has access to our physiological reaction, right? Temperature, pupil dilate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's the interpretation question, but there's also, I think, more fundamental is, in particular in a robot of care, is does the robot do what that individual wants it to do? Or is the robot programmed to do what is best for that person? right? And that's I think that takes the emotion out of the question, but we haven't addressed that. Are we going to design in the physical space these robots to be responsive to our will, as fallible and messy and ugly as it can be sometimes, and maybe I don't want to live, and give me more painkillers because, you know, I know it's not good for me, I don't care? Or is it going to be kind of like a nanny kind of, right, sort of this artificial where it's going to do whatever's best for you to prolong your life or whatever the case is, or keep you from eating another bag of Doritos because it's not good for you or something like that. I think that's the real puzzle that we ought to dive into.
The good old hedonic demon, like one day it will fold us all into paper clips because I didn't tell it to make me, that I don't enjoy being made into paper. But like, it's really, really interesting. Like,
which I think is terrible analogy.
That's a fantastic way to close this panel. Thank you very much.